Okay,
All right, we are being live streamed.
cool.
Um, so great. So, oh dear, I did just remove somebody. Okay, for everybody who's watching, I am sorry for being unorganized. We're trying a new thing over Zoom, and forgive me if I accidentally kicked you out. You can still ask questions and participate on LinkedIn. And for future reference, I think I'll just stay with the old way. This is very confusing to us. Anyway, I'm thrilled to be talking to Joe Friedman, or should I say Joseph? I never know. Which would you rather go by?
I use Joseph professionally, but
All right, Joseph Friedman.
yeah,
And we're going to be talking about cannabis and the politics of cannabis. And I wanted to go over this topic, one, because we are going to be talking a little bit about it at the event. Joseph is going to be giving us a bit of a primer, but I'm also really intrigued about this. I've been reading a lot about what's going on lately. Um, and sorry, I forgot one more thing. Just about what's going on lately. And Joseph and I had had several conversations about cannabis being legalized on why it's not legalized, why it's has the negative connotation that it does in terms of legality. And that dates back, you said, we talked a little bit about reefer madness. And then I don't know if we want to touch on this, but perhaps you can also clarify this like brief moment in time where for compounding you could, or some compounders did start to use CBD and compound with it, and then it got taken away. We talked a little bit about that with Craig and
right.
some other people. But anyway, I thought it would be really great for you to kind of go into, before we talk about at the conference and other places, the nitty gritty of cannabis, to really talk a little bit about the history and how it's affecting the politics and the regulatory stuff.
And it's also affecting the idea that millions and millions of Americans could be helped with this miraculous plant,
Mm-hmm.
not because of these goofy, like backwards laws that are preventing the research and development. And you know what? And I'm not a fan of just having pot shops in every corner of
Right.
every street in America. But I think what's really important is the idea of a healthcare professional or someone that's very knowledgeable to be in every dispensary in the nation, because a lot of patients walk in and they're just not getting served up with good information. It's very transactional, and unless you know what you want when you walk in, you're not going to get a lot of help.
Yeah. And I do want to say, obviously, if and you should know this from every other time, if you have any questions, just put them in the chat and we'll address them. Just why don't you give us a little bit about your background?
Okay, well, I'm a pharmacist. I also have a master's in business, and I've spent a lot of time working in the corporate environment, in healthcare. And I came across the idea of opening up a dispensary in Illinois, since Illinois was going legal back in 2013. And so I was closely watching what was happening. And just to kind of move this forward, because I know we have limited time, is I put together a group. We were successful with putting together an application, several applications, and we got one dispensary in a northern suburb of Chicago, and we opened up, and it was very pharmacy centric. It was the only dispensary in the entire state of Illinois that actually had full-time healthcare professionals working in it. And I also uh, carved out relationships with two colleges of pharmacy where we had fourth year pharmacy students doing one of their required APPE clinical rotations in a medical cannabis dispensary for the first time. And I know that's now happening around the country. In fact, just last night I was out with my good partner and one of my former pharmacy students who's now a pharmacist, who it was just a great little gathering out at Old Orchard Shopping Center. We had dinner, and her and her sister are both pharmacists, and they're opening up a dispensary in sort of a neighborhood they were brought up in, but they're really going to take care of patients when they open up. So
Mhm.
that's very cool.
Excellent. So why don't we start out and we can talk a little bit about what you said. And I'm sorry if I look like I'm distracted. I'm trying to set up the messages so I know that I get people's comments because I'm very sure people have a lot to say. Why don't we start out talking a little bit as I mentioned, when we first started talking, you said that the demonization, if you will, of cannabis started early on in the last century. And of course we talked a little bit about that movie Reefer Madness, which we were going to encourage everybody to watch prior to the event. So what is the history of why was it that we were able to move past prohibition with alcohol but not with marijuana? And then what has been some of the stumbling blocks in terms of moving it forward as we're in a medical capacity?
So that's a very interesting question with a very complex answer. And the demonization started happening in the 1930s with Harry Anslinger, who was the first deputy drug director, whatever he was. But he just attributed marijuana to the demon, and and changing the minds of black men that wanted to have sex with white women. I mean, it was just ridiculous. And you watch Reefer Madness and you'll see that. So that demonization, certainly has lightened up over the years, with California going legal, 12 or 13 years ago, and then Colorado afterwards, but it still exists. And there are still prohibitionists out there that what they do, and I'm not saying that there's, every player out there in the cannabis industry is doing it the right way or the way that we did it, but there are some bad players. And they're just in it to sell as much pot as possible. And there's unfortunately some bad situations that can come up when someone who is predisposed to psychosis, for example, consumes too much, or someone who's not familiar consumes too much or of the wrong product, or a senior who's trying to treat an underlying condition that doesn't get the good information. So what prohibitionists do is they focus in on the bad players and the one-off situations. I'm not saying that they don't exist, they do exist, but they're minimal compared to what the prohibitionists put on their plate and put out to the general public. And so that has kept, cannabis, illegal at the federal level. I mean, one of the prohibitionists, he's got, he's offices in 20 states. He's got all these, Pete Ricketts, who's the governor of Nebraska, was on a podium 3 or 4 months ago with prohibition stickers all over his podium, just saying, marijuana is not medicine, it'll kill your kids. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, they're reaching politicians and reaching politicians to think that this is so negative is the issue. Now, one of the things that these prohibitionists don't do is talk about the benefits, and the legalization would certainly not open up all the bad things that would happen. The sky wouldn't fall. It would open up research and development. And another thing about what's happening is, the big companies that are being impacted, big alcohol, big pharma, big tobacco, they're seeing profits erode from the cannabis.
And you mean in their products?
Yeah, and they've got lobbyists, very powerful lobbyists that are also, talking to the politicians and trying to prevent legalization, because legalization is going to affect the pharmaceutical industry, the alcohol industry, and the tobacco. It's already affecting it, but it's going to affect it in a bigger way. Mm-hmm. So there's money, there's misinformation, and that's sort of the Reader's Digest version of what's happening today.
Yeah. I always think it's very funny, that comment that you said about the prohibitionist and, marijuana killing your kids, because obviously there are plenty of legal drugs that do that too. Mm-hmm. So as well as alcohol.
Right.
It just seems a really strange argument to be having. It seems to me I know one of the problems with it not being legalized is the lack of research, which you just touched upon. It seems to me it would be easier for people to prove that it's bad if we were allowed to have more research. I mean, obviously, I'd be a proponent of it proving it's good, but when you need data to say something to create a point. So, do you see any path forward? And again, I don't mean to set it up as a prohibitionist. I think you understand what I'm saying is that data, it provides an intelligent argument rather than just we hope and we think and we assume. Do you see any way to move forward with or let me back that up. Are you seeing any movement in terms of the legalization of cannabis on a federal level? I've been reading articles. I was reading some articles which backdated back to the elections and where they were comparing Biden and Trump and things like that. And my understanding was that Biden wasn't making any promises other than he was going to try to decriminalize it, which is good, but not necessarily. That's still a far cry from legalizing it. So are you seeing it since Biden's been elected? Are you seeing any movement in a positive direction?
Well, we're seeing, movement, on the Democratic side of the equation. Chuck Schumer has put forth legislation to open up banking for the cannabis industry. That's a big problem, not having banks and dealing with cash. And also, decriminalization and things like that. So I think we need to take little steps instead of just, full legalization all at once, that I think Schumer's bill was trying to do. But I think little steps would be good in the right direction. Now, it's a little disappointing that when Biden got into office, everyone was hopeful that he was going to legalize cannabis and all the stocks jumped nicely. Well, since nothing's been done in 2 years, all the stocks are in the toilet.
Right.
And there's nothing on the horizon from the standpoint of legalization. Now, there could be some minor legalization things like the Safe Banking Act or things like that, but it's not enough to really help the stocks at this point.
Well, and I'm glad you brought up the Safe Banking Act. That was something I wanted to ask about. But so in responding to what you just said, what if the Safe Banking Act moves forward? Why wouldn't that help the stocks? Because isn't banking a big part of the problem for businesses?
It should help the stocks, but it just seems like there's this fight in Congress, and even safe banking, which would be a good thing. I mean, I used to, me and my good partner used to on Sundays after 2 weeks of sales sit there and just count cash, and then on Monday we would have our security guy with a backpack take all that cash to a bank, and never at the same time, and usually not on the same day, just to make sure that
right.
We weren't going to be putting our security guy at risk carrying all this cash. So it is a problem. And in fact, one of the crazy things about dealing with cash is there was dispensaries in Colorado that were paying their federal taxes in cash because no bank would work with them, right? And then the IRS penalized them for paying their taxes in cash. So it's messed up.
Yeah, that is confusing. I was just checking to see if anybody had any comments or questions, and I'm hoping that the system is working.
And I thought this was going to be a little touch on compounding pharmacy and cannabis.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to talk about compounding. So yes, let's go back in that direction.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Well, one of the things that I was working in a compounding pharmacy for 3 years prior to, opening up my dispensary, and that compounding pharmacy was just, down the block from my dispensary. So I had a great relationship, and you interviewed Craig Badagowski, who was, the head pharmacist at that compounding pharmacy. We would have patients who couldn't stomach cannabis for whatever reason, and so. I had one patient who had a brain tumor, and she went to another dispensary, and they gave her the right products, but she was having a hell of a time just tolerating them. So I sent her to the compounding pharmacy, where Craig actually took her cannabis and put it into acid stable capsules capsules that would bypass, her stomach where she was having the issues and go straight, into her intestines. And that helped, at least from that standpoint. Now, working with a compounding pharmacy, I envisioned, back in the day when we first opened, if this got legalized, compounding pharmacies would have a heyday. They would have, all the different strains, to work with. They would have all the different powdered pharmaceuticals that they got from companies like Letco, and make these very unique, pharmaceutically elegant products using CBD, THC, some of the other cannabinoids and terpenes and flavonoids and drugs as well. But use drugs in smaller quantities and use cannabis in larger quantities because we know it's safe.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and I guess that's was one of the disappointments, because I think one of the reasons why I am, and I assume all the other compounders are tracking what's going on in the industry, because the upside is so immensely huge. And it's interesting. I had a conversation with a cannabis pharmacist last week who is also getting involved in pharmacogenomics, which we're also talking about at the conference, because I see all these three things tying together in the future of pharmacy. But what she was talking, exactly what you were talking about, which is getting patients, she was using PGX to identify how patients metabolize certain drugs. And she said she was getting patients that doctors kept giving them pills and the pills weren't working. So she would test them and say, well, because, when you're taking it orally, it's not working. So let's try, a bunch of other, other methods for you to, get the medication. And she was applying that to the cannabis products that she works with. But somebody told me something interesting about politics. We were talking about politics or politics and pharmacy. And the quote, to paraphrase what he said, he was like, if you're not involved, then you have no right to be in here. And his take was that there's so much political stuff going on right now with pharmacy, be it cannabis or compounding, that you have to become politically active in order to move the goals forward. And if you're not doing that, if you're not making friends with your councilman, with your senator, with your, talking to your senator, talking to your congressman, talking to your local, political people, then, as he put it, you're just whining. What would you think about that statement? Do you think that compounders and cannabis pharmacists need to be more proactive in terms of on the political front and moving this issue forward?
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I fully agree with that. I mean, several years ago, the compounding pharmacy got a big black eye. New England Compounding Centers of America, I think that's what they were called.
We all know
the East Coast, sent out. I mean, they were manufacturing, and they didn't have a license to manufacture, but they were sending out these steroid injections that were meant to be intrathecal. I mean, to be put into the spine, and many patients died because of contamination. And that, what happened after that happened is all of a sudden all these inspectors were visiting all these compounding pharmacies around the country and shutting down half of them. Now the one compounding pharmacy that I worked with down the street, I mean, there was two compounding pharmacies associated with that organization, and they really beefed up their all the things needed in order to satisfy the inspectors and do things the right way, which was great. So they survived, but so many compounding pharmacies got shut down. So, and right now, I mean, compounding pharmacy still has kind of a black eye. And I think you to your point, it's good to be politically involved. Not only from a compounding pharmacy standpoint, but also from a cannabis standpoint, because, this is good medicine and patients aren't getting it because of, politicians.
Yeah. So there was a big political campaign about the BHRT. Are you familiar with that whole thing? Right. Yeah. And I'm wondering if compounders are interested in working with I don't know how to say that. Cannabinoids?
Cannabinoid.
We'll call it
Cannabidiol?
We'll call it CBD and cannabis.
Okay. Yeah, cannabidiol and
Right.
tetrahydrocannabidiol.
No, you're right. Cabin. I don't know what's wrong with me.
Yeah.
I'm
Anyway,
falling
THC.
over my tongues today. My
Okay.
tongue. But I was wondering if the same type of campaign makes sense. And they went on a big PR campaign to try to, to influence, and I hope people don't take that the wrong way when I say influence, because the FDA, did some things that were a little bit, debatable. But I'm just wondering if some sort of PR campaign, what they did was they enlisted patients, patient stories, things like that on the benefits of BHRT. I'm wondering if we need to look at the industry, the two industries actually, cannabis and compounding, should bond together and do that type of thing. Anyway, I'm just theorizing here.
Well, I think the whole idea of hormone replacement therapy is, it works. I mean, when I was working in the compounding pharmacy, we had, weight loss, we had pet medicine, we had hormone replacement therapy products, and they were popular.
Yeah.
And, I think the idea of doing that, certainly has benefits.
Mhm.
And I mean, I don't have that much to say about it, except that I think it's not a bad idea, especially in a particular patient population where you can draw benefits, from women going through menopause or men having, ED issues and things like that. Well, there's HCG. Well, there's other stuff for that. But anyways, I don't have much to say about it, except it's a good idea.
Yeah, no, what I meant was that like kind of following that model in terms of trying to influence the politicians. Just really getting out there, talking about the benefits, using the patient stories in order to promote the use of cannabis and CBD and the other cannabinoids.
Well, there's no compounded drug that's approved by the FDA.
Right, not now.
So there's no regulations. There's no, and all they can do is just have their inspectors walk in and say, your sterile room isn't up to code, and you need to spend several $100,000 getting that up to code. Otherwise, we're shutting you down. So yeah, the influence of the inspectors and of the FDA is not necessarily on the products at this point. It's really on the workflow and the functionality of those companies.
Got it. And then the DEA, because then if there's no regulatory stuff, is it because it's still considered legal? Like, what happened when all those compounders had to rip all the CBD products off their shelf, or the cannabis off their shelf?
Well, I think Craig explained that when you spoke to him, and I think he started to compound with CBD.
Yeah, he did.
The inspector came in and said, "You can't do
and
that."
said no. That's right. And CCPA had to pull back all the product as well that they were selling because of that.
Well, I think he continued.
Or not because of that, but I mean that at that time, that's what I'm saying. People started and then they all had to stop. So
yeah, I think Craig continued to have CBD products on the shelf that you can buy off the shelf that came from manufacturers, but he couldn't compound with CBD.
Them. All right. Any parting thoughts?
Well, always. I think it's great what you're doing with the Pharmasalon, and you're probably going to mention that as well. And it's great to educate. I think that's the most important thing right now, is not necessarily going up against these prohibitionists. It's just doing a fair and balanced and scientific explanation of cannabis that hopefully will, muffle their negative, cherry pick BS.
Hopefully. Although right. I don't want to end on a negative note, but I've been reading a lot how facts never change people's minds. So.
Well, facts don't change people's minds, but I think examples do.
That's a good point. Stories do.
Stories of and research, and I mean, there's so many good things that are going on that dwarf all the bad things.
That is absolutely true. Well, thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it. I hope it wasn't too chaotic for you.
No, it's fine.
As you said, I will mention our upcoming RX Influencers Salon, which Joe is chairing the cannabis track. So anybody who has any other questions, of course, they are free. They need to come. And it's a parallel track to compounding. You can bounce back and forth between that and PGX. And it's October 24th and 25th in St. Louis. And everybody can go to the website, pharmasalon.com/RxInfluencer. RX Influencer, get more information and register. And do
Excellent.
register because it is our unique format, which is why we call it a salon. It's going to be all discussion based, no PowerPoint presentations. It's just panels, fireside chats, and roundtable discussions. The idea that you can learn from your colleagues. So because of that format, space is limited. So sign up early. Anyway, thank you so much, Joe. I really appreciate it. And we'll talk again soon.
Thank you, Vivian.
All right. Bye. I actually don't know. Oh, here we go.